Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Wendy Lowe, and I'd like to welcome you to this scoping meeting, which is hosted by the Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management. In compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, DOE is preparing a supplemental environmental impact statement for remediation of Area 4 and the northern buffer zone at Santa Susana Field Laboratory. The notice of intent to prepare the supplemental EIS was published in the Federal Register on December 27, 2024, and that publication initiated a 60-day public scoping period, which was later extended by 30 days. With the extension, the scoping period will now end on March 27, 2025. Materials related to this supplemental EIS, including the notice of intent, are available at the project online at the project website. We'll put the URL for the website in the chat for those of you who are participating online. If you're participating by telephone, please listen carefully while I read the URL if you would like to open the slides and follow along. The URL is www.ssfleis.com/SEIS. Additional information is available at 4 public reading rooms that are located at the Simi Valley Library, which is located at 2969 Tapo Canyon Road in Simi Valley, at Hidden Hills City Hall, which is located at 6165 Spring Valley Road in Hidden Hills. The third one is at California State Northridge Oviatt Library, which is located on the second floor in room 265. And then the last one is at the State of California's Department of Toxic Substances Control, which is located at 9211 Oakdale Avenue in Chatsworth. As we begin, I'd like to note that the presentation portion of this meeting is being recorded. All participant cameras are turned off and microphones will remain muted for the presentation portion of the meeting. Today is March 6th, 2025, and the time is now approximately 6:03 p.m. Pacific, I should note. Tonight's online meeting is one of 2 public scoping meetings that are being held during the public scoping period. The second meeting will be held in person on Tuesday, March 18th, beginning at 6:00 p.m. in the ballroom at the Grand Vista Hotel, which is located at 999 Enchanted Way in Simi Valley, California. The purpose of the 2 scoping meetings is to share information about DOE's plans to prepare the supplemental EIS and to provide the opportunity for members of the public to submit their comments on the scope of the supplemental EIS. As the moderator this evening, it's my job to make sure that this public meeting is conducted in a respectful manner. I would note that I'm an independent consultant who provides public meeting services for federal, state, and local agencies, and I have no role in the development of the supplemental EIS. Now I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Joshua Mengers, who is DOE's Federal Project Director at the Energy Technology Engineering Center, and Ms. Pamela Hartman, who is the Deputy Federal Project Director at ETEC, which is located at Santa Susana Field Lab. They will provide a summary of the progress on cleanup to date, as well as an overview of the alternatives and the potential environmental effects they expect to analyze in the supplemental EIS. After the presentation, I will explain the procedures we'll follow for inviting your scoping comments. Over to you, Dr. Mengers.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Before we start, let me begin by thanking everyone for attending tonight. I know it's difficult to find time out of your busy schedules to engage in these sorts of public meetings, and we really do appreciate your participation in this SEIS public scoping process. We know there are many demands for your time and attention, and we don't take your attendance tonight for granted. Before we get into the material, I'd also like to continue with introductions. For those of you who have not met me, I'm Dr. Josh Mengers. I've been with the U.S. Department of Energy since 2012. where I started in Washington, D.C., working on renewable energy projects, specifically in geothermal research and development. In 2019, I moved to Simi Valley with my family to join the DOE's remediation of the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. Since then, I've become an active member of this community, and I'm proud to call myself one of your neighbors. I know many of you have been active with this cleanup since long before I joined the project, and I appreciate your continued engagement. With that, let me pass it off to Pam.
Thanks, Josh. I'm Pam Hartman. I joined Josh and the DOE team here at ETEC just about a year and a half ago, but I have worked at the site since 2010. I started out as a geologist and then became a field team lead over the years. And during that time, I've had the opportunity to work on, participate in, and lead multiple field sampling events and other types of field activities. I also live in Simi Valley, and I really care about the surrounding communities. I'm very excited and happy to be able to use my years of experience and my knowledge of the site in my current role as Deputy Director.
Thanks, Pam. So here's an outline of what we're going to be discussing today. Starting on the left-hand side, we'll begin with a project background. I'll give a site overview, some of the project scope, and where we are on NEPA status before I pass it off to Pam to give some additional information on the recent progress. I'll then back up with the presentation in the middle column, and I'll discuss the NEPA process, starting at a higher level, discussing where we've been since the final EIS, FEIS, what the next steps are for the supplemental EIS, SEIS, move on to the purpose and the need and proposed alternatives. That right-hand column is where you'll get a chance to provide your comment. I'll start by giving a brief overview of some tips to make your comments count, discuss how the comments will be used before I hand it off to Wendy to facilitate the comment portion. Diving into the project background. Many of you are aware, Santa Susana Field Lab, pictured on the right-hand side of the screen, is made up of 4 areas and a northern and southern buffer zone. It's in the eastern part of Ventura County, adjacent to Los Angeles County. To the north of the field lab is Simi Valley. To the south is Bell Canyon. To the east is Canoga Park and San Fernando Valley. It's approximately just under 3,000 acres. The majority of it is owned by the Boeing Corporation. Area 2 and a portion of Area 1 are owned by the federal government and administered by NASA. DOE conducted our operations in Area 4 beginning in the 1950s, where we conducted nuclear energy and liquid metals research. Our mission here is to remediate the environmental effects from that research and development, something that we've been doing since before our research and development ceased in the late 90s. Continuing that mission moving forward, the majority of the work that is remaining is in groundwater and soil remediation. You'll see the groundwater remediation is governed by the 2007 Consent Order, which is a RCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act based order. The soils, in 2010, DOE signed the Administrative Order on Consent, which was an agreement to clean up the soils to background. I also want to note there are remaining building demolition that we have left to go. There is 1 basement and 2 vaults, as well as a number of slabs, asphalt pads, anything that's below the ground surface. That's what we mean by below grade of the DOE-owned structures in Area 4. To proceed with this cleanup, we have to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And that's, as you see at the bottom of the screen there, a federal law requiring us to consider the environmental impacts of our project. In 2018, DOE published a final EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, FEIS, which considered building demolition and various alternatives, groundwater remediation, and soil remediation. In 2019, we published a Record of Decision, or ROD, for building demolition. In 2020, we published that Record of Decision, or ROD, for groundwater remediation. These records of decision, or RODs, allow us to continue progress remediating the site. And so Pam is now going to give you an update on some of that progress that we've made. Oh, pardon me. Remediating the site.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, some of the notable recent progress we have made. One has been the implementation of the groundwater implementation plan. That is an action that started in 2017, and it consisted of pumping and removing contaminated groundwater from the former sodium disposal facility. Since it started in 2017, we have removed over 60,000 gallons of contaminated groundwater from the site. In 2024, we installed an automated pumping system in the former sodium disposal facility. It is a solar powered automated pumping system, and it allows us to now pump much more efficiently and at a higher rate. For example, we have pumped 2,700 gallons just this year in January and February. In 2021, we completed the demolition of all the above ground DOE owned buildings. So, what are the future cleanup plans? Our next steps include ramping up groundwater remediation, completing the remaining building demolition. Those would be the below ground structures that Josh mentioned, completing the record of decision for soils, and beginning soil remediation. If you go to the next slide, it shows us a nice picture of the buildings prior to demolition and then current day as they are now after the removal of all 18. Thanks.
Thanks, Pam. Let's now take a step back and talk more about the NEPA process. So as I mentioned, we have completed the final EIS, FEIS, and now we are proposing a supplemental SEIS. It's worth noting that the SEIS adds on top of the final EIS. It does not replace the final EIS. As I noted again, we are focused on the soil remediation in Area 4 in the northern buffer zone for this SEIS, as we already have records of decision for the building demolition and the groundwater. You'll see at the bottom of this slide the 3 reasons when an SEIS is needed to be prepared. I want to draw your attention to the first 2 bullets. The first one is when the action would cause substantial changes relevant to the environmental concerns. The new alternatives that DOE is proposing, we believe, would cause those substantial changes and thus would require us to publish a supplemental EIS. The second bullet there includes new circumstances or information that would be needed to consider. And that new information and changes are covered in this slide. You'll see on the left-hand side the environmental conditions that have changed. The main one there is the Woolsey fire. Our final EIS, came out in 2018, but the analysis, the Woolsey fire also started in 2018. The analysis for that did not include the Woolsey fire. So this is an opportunity for us to update those environmental conditions, not just for the Woolsey fire, but for any other changes in the biological, cultural resources, updating socioeconomic data, information on disposal facilities, etc., that have changed in the past few years since our final EIS. In that middle column, you'll see additional updates from the project status. As Pam gave some highlights on our recent progress, the building demolition has moved forward. Our groundwater remediation has continued to make progress, and so we can update that information as well. But those bottom 3 bullets in the middle column, I want to draw your attention to as well. The laboratory method reporting limits, or MRLs, and backfill availability data, we anticipate getting new data, and this is based on DTSC asking the responsible parties to conduct additional analysis into understanding laboratory capabilities and what quantity and quality of backfill is available. We are gathering that data now, and we will incorporate that data in our SEIS. The other new information is that the Department of Substances Control proposed a new soil alternative approach that they have termed the multiple lines of evidence, which they presented to the public as part of their Soil Smarts workshops that are ongoing. Also, in 2022, there was a settlement agreement between Boeing and DTSC that outlined another new soil cleanup approach that is a resident with garden approach. This is all new information that we did not have in the 2018 final EIS. And that final column lists a couple of the laws, the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2018, and then DOE NEPA implementation regulations found at 10 CFR 1021. All of these will be included in our analysis for the supplemental EIS. What are the steps involved in an SEIS? You'll see on the right-hand side, we are in that second box from the top, the scoping process. We started the first box, the notice of intent to prepare the SEIS, as Wendy mentioned, on December 27th at the end of last year. That initiated a 60-day public scoping period. And because of the wildfires and wanting to make sure that all of our stakeholders had an opportunity to participate, we extended that another 60-day process, another 30 days, and it now ends March 27th. This is the first of 2 public scoping meetings that DOE will be hosting. You'll see, and as Wendy had mentioned, the next one on Tuesday, March 18th at 6 p.m. in the ballroom of the Grand Vista Hotel. Moving on down the rest of the process, this is not your last opportunity to provide public comments on the SEIS. After we finish the scoping process, we will incorporate the comments and develop a draft SEIS, at which point we will open up a public comment period on that draft. We'll incorporate the comments from the draft SEIS in the final SEIS, and then we will proceed to issue a record of decision for soils to allow our soils remediation to proceed. You can find on this slide a summary of DOE's cleanup mission at Santa Susana Field Lab, and that's to remediate the environmental legacy from our operations at the site. DOE is conducting this SEIS to allow us to continue the progress in a manner that's protective of human health and the environment. It's really worth emphasizing here on this slide that safety is DOE's top priority in everything that we do, and we make sure that both the public and our workers remain safe to the best of our extent. So here it's probably helpful to take a step back and describe a little bit more about the recent history of soil remediation at Santa Susana Field Lab. You'll see listed on this slide are the 5 scenarios that we considered for soil remediation in our final EIS. And before I dive into the first one, which is the cleanup to AOC with the current lookup table values, it's worth giving a description of what that actually means, because that's a mouthful of jargon. As I mentioned at the top, the AOC, Administrative Order on Consent, DOE signed in 2010 as an agreement to clean. What does that mean? The background standard means local background. We want to put back what was there before. Unfortunately, we didn't have the data of what was there before. And as Pam, as a good geologist, would note, the soil conditions depend on what geology you're in. This is why you have different habitats. So you needed to find what local background is depending on the geologic formation. So since we didn't have the data, we needed to go and find some data that could tell us what was there before. So US EPA and DTSC looked for pristine sites in the geologic formations that are on site and sampled those sites to develop what are called lookup table values, or LUT, some people call it. And that is what defines what background is. The LUT values were not developed in 2010 in the AOC. It just defined a process for us to develop, for DTSC and EPA to develop these lookup table values for chemicals and radionuclides. So now that I've given a little bit of that detail of that, what the background cleanup is, I want to tell you about these 5 scenarios. So we agreed to clean up to background in the 2010 AOC, and so we were obviously going to analyze that alternative. I want to jump down to the bottom of these alternatives in the no action alternative. As I mentioned in our mission to clean up, to remediate the environmental impact, it was not DOE's intent to tell you that we're planning to walk away without doing anything. Evaluating a no action alternative gives us a baseline and a point of comparison to say, if this is how much we're going to do with no action, here's the comparison of what we would do in any of the other scenarios that we evaluated. But why did we go beyond there? In our analysis, and I'll come back to this because I know this is going to be something that concerns many of the stakeholders we have on the call. We determined that the lookup table values, the AOC with the lookup table values alternative, was not implementable. So given that we would only have 2 scenarios, one that's not implementable and one that's do nothing, we thought it was reasonable to consider other alternatives. So we looked at revising the lookup table values, and here it's worth noting that these revised lookup table values were based on risk-based screening levels, RBSLs. So I'll say that again, risk-based screening levels. Those aren't background. We understand that this was what was available and what would be expedient to evaluate. The other scenarios we looked at are what's called conservation of natural resources. These were risk-based cleanups that would be done at many other sites across California or the United States. We looked at 2 different end use cases, one where it would be resident without garden, and another where there'd be open space or recreator use scenario. We evaluated the extent of the soil cleanup and the environmental impacts in each of these alternatives for soil cleanup. And but here I know that it's important to tell you more details about why the AOC is not implementable. So listed here are 3 of the highlights, but there's more detail that we have in our final EIS. In particular, Chapter 2, if you want to look at Section 2.3.3.1, the implementability of the AOC requirements. There's a lot more detail there, but for this presentation, I'll leave it to these bullet points. In cleaning up the site, we have a requirement to restore the site, and you would provide replacement soils that are called backfill that would restore the site. In our initial analysis in the 2018 AOC, we looked for some backfill sources, and we were not able to find any that met that cleanup standard. And that's important to note there, that would mean that we would potentially be replacing soils and not have the same quality of soils to replace and restore the site with those. The next concern is that some of the laboratory capabilities were not at a high enough resolution. The laboratories couldn't tell well enough if the chemicals were at the lookup table values in some of the samples. And what this would mean is that we would get inaccurate results. We would not know if a chemical was there or not to the level that the lookup table values required. Again, this just would cause excessive soil to be removed that wasn't posing any risk or wasn't even certain if it was above background or not. And then this last bullet I think is really important to note here. There are pristine sites that were used to develop the lookup table values that I told you about before in the same geologic condition. The data that was taken from those sites to develop the lookup table values does not pass the lookup table values. And so all of these led us to the conclusion that the lookup table values are not implementable, and conducting an AOC cleanup to the lookup table values would do more environmental harm than good. And this isn't just DOE's conclusion. In DTSC's recent Soil Smarts workshops, they presented similar data with similar conclusions. They also have a technical memorandum on their multiple lines of evidence approach that outlines some of these same concerns. So how do we move forward? DOE is proposing to look at new scenarios, new alternatives in our SEIS. And you'll see these listed here at the bottom of the screen. Updated lookup table values, and I'll come back to each of these in a little bit more detail. They each get a slide on their own. So I'll just tell you at a high level right now. This first one, updated lookup table values, is what DOE is proposing to update these lookup table values in alignment with background to be able to execute the AOC. The second, the multiple lines of evidence or MLE approach. DOE is proposing to analyze DTSC's multiple lines of evidence approach that they have proposed to the public. And the third, the resident with garden scenario. And that is the scenario that, to the best of DOE's understanding, is going to be used to clean up the Boeing portions of Santa Susana Field Lab. I also want to note that DOE is consider whether any of the alternatives from the 2018 final EIS is still reasonable and should be reevaluated in the SEIS. I also want to draw your attention to the right-hand side of the screen. We do not have a preferred alternative at this time. We are analyzing these alternatives, and as part of the analysis, we will identify the preferred alternative, and that will be in our final SEIS. So let me dive into each of these alternatives in a little bit more detail. The updated lookup table values. Now, I want to draw the distinction between updated lookup table values and revised lookup table values because it is a little bit confusing. The revised lookup table values from our final EIS were based on the risk-based screening levels and so not in line with background. What we are proposing to do with the updated lookup table value alternative is use laboratory detection capabilities and incorporate data from those pristine background sites to update the lookup table values to allow them to be implemented. That last bullet point on the screen is really important here. We are proposing to retain the other provisions of the AOC in this alternative. The multiple lines of evidence approach. I don't want to say too much here because this is not DOE's approach, but what we are proposing to do is analyze DTSC's approach. Now, I will note that the Soil Smarts workshops that I've been mentioning are separate from this SEIS process that DOE is conducting right now. But DOE has been participating and listening to DTSC in those meetings, in that Soil Smarts workshop, and we will evaluate the analysis, the final alternative of multiple lines of evidence that DTSC proposes. But what DOE understands about DTSC's proposal is that they will use many lines of evidence, including all of the background data and some risk-based approaches that ensure that any concentrations left in place would not represent an increased risk over background levels. It's also worth noting that the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, identifies the use of multiple lines of evidence as a best practice in environmental cleanup. The resident with garden risk-based alternative. And before I get into this, I want to say I understand this is not a background cleanup. This is a risk-based cleanup. But the reason that DOE is proposing to evaluate this alternative is we believe that this will be the alternative used, agreed upon by DTSC, our regulator, for another responsible party across an administrative boundary at Santa Susana. And so we felt it was reasonable to evaluate the impacts of cleaning up to this alternative in our SEIS. Again, I want to foot stomp here that this really is not saying we are proposing that this is our cleanup alternative. We are proposing to evaluate the Boeing settlement agreement from 2022 alternative of resident with garden cleanup standard. So here's the laundry list of the potential environmental effects, and I'm not going to read this slide to you, but you can see on this slide, these are the variety of areas that we will consider the environmental effects from our action, from our soil remediation in Area 4 in the northern buffer zone. I'll leave this up here for a while and say that this is typical in the NEPA process. If you were paying attention while we were going through our NEPA process, or maybe while NASA was going through theirs, this is not going to be new to you, but this is the list of what we are looking to consider here. So this also may help you if you are trying to provide us comments and telling us about the impacts that you think we should consider more. This list might help you consider how to frame your comments and what would be more important to you or less important to you, and telling us how those effects would impact you. So now let me summarize what these three new proposed alternatives are. So the first one, the updated lookup table values. Background lookup table values that retain the other provisions of the AOC. This is what DOE is proposing for this SEIS. The other two are not DOE's proposals, but the second one, multiple lines of evidence approach, is DTSC's proposal for a background cleanup that uses risk-based lines of evidence to minimize the removal of clean soil and thus reduce the environmental impacts of a background cleanup. The third one is the resident with garden risk-based scenario. And this is the cleanup scenario that's outlined in the 2022 settlement agreement between DTSC and Boeing that we are aware is likely to be the cleanup standard for Boeing's areas of responsibility. That's a mouthful. So now let's get into the part of the process where we'll have your comment submission. But before we get there, let me tell you a little bit, some tips that we've seen from other places of good practices of how to help make your comments count. So we want you to provide comments on the scoping of this. So identification of reasonable alternatives, information, any analysis relevant to this proposed action here. The proposed action is the DOE's soil removal at Santa Susana in Area 4 and the northern buffer zone. That's the proposed action. What specific environmental issues would be addressed? We want to note here that this scoping process is not meant to vote which one's your favorite, which one's not. There's other opportunities later in this process where, where you'll have the opportunity to provide other comments. But during this scoping process, it's not really the appropriate time to vote on which one's your favorite or not. Please keep your comments to the scope of this proposed action. DOE's soils remediation in Area 4 of Santa Susana Field Lab and the northern buffer zone. And giving the alternatives and how they affect you, how they affect your community. Specific examples. Those can really help us understand what's important to you. So how do we use your comments? When the scoping period is finished, we'll analyze the comments. We determine if there needs to be a change in the scope of the SEIS, and then we will use that to prepare the draft SEIS. We're also going to include a summary of the relevant alternatives, information, analysis submitted by commenters for consideration. When responding to these comments, we may do so as individual comments or as groups of comments. And we want to try to be as transparent as we can in this process in how we've used those comments to develop any new alternatives, to modify our analysis, to make any factual corrections, or explain why a change was not made. So That's really what we're looking to find from your comments. So before we get into this is my last slide. I want to give you a little bit more of a timeline just so you know what to expect and what's next. Obviously, we're in this public comment period. This is the first of 2 scoping meetings. The next one, as we've mentioned a couple times, is on the 18th. Then the public scoping period ends on March 27th. We'll incorporate that information and prepare our analysis. The draft analysis we are anticipating will be prepared by the summer of 2026. And then the final SEIS we're looking at the spring of 2027. I just want to note that these dates are our best estimates as of right now and are subject to change. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I truly thank you. And I'll be here listening. And Wendy's going to note this, but this is a public comment. This is not question and answer. So I'll be here listening, taking notes. And it's really important for me to hear your concerns. Unfortunately, tonight is not an opportunity for us to have a dialogue because we want to make sure there's enough time for you to provide your comments. And with that, I'll hand it off to Wendy.